For almost 100 years, people all around the globe have been captivated by this enigmatic mystery. Jack the Ripper, the identity of the notorious serial murderer whose crimes have perplexed the world for decades. So be it. Right up to this moment. The incredible thing is that a shawl found at the site of one of his crimes had DNA that matches perfectly. Jack the Ripper has been a figure of terror at crime scenes and in history books for well over a century. Whoever committed those heinous murders in 1888 has been the subject of much speculation, debate, and obsession. It seems the long-awaited solution has arrived after 137 years, and no one was expecting it. Our entire understanding of a terrifying enigma has been upended by this revelation. Was the truth always there, just waiting to be discovered? Come along as we reveal the stunning identity of the notorious Jack the Ripper. Not to mention the shocking proof that wraps up this case. Victorian London, Jack the Ripper's murderous underworld. London was not always the pristine metropolis it is today. Whitechapel was one section that seemed and felt totally different. There, life was tough. People were flooding the streets, yet the majority of them were struggling financially. There were a lot of dilapidated little dwellings. A lot of families slept in the same room. Garbage, smoking, and disease permeated the ethnic neighborhood in London's East End. The streets were not cleaned or garbage was not properly disposed of. You will comprehend Jack the Ripper's actions if you perceive the gloomy environment in which he operated. First things first, London is home to thousands of cold cases, some of which go back hundreds of years rather than decades. The most well-known of these is the killings committed by Jack the Ripper, murder rampage that occurred in the East End in 1888 and resulted in the deaths of at least 5 women. Now, after 137 years after the murders, for an extended period of time, they remained concealed. Mary Ann Nichols was the first victim of the Jack the Ripper. Her body was discovered early on August 31st, 1888. What was once Bucks Row is now Durward Street, and her corpse was placed there. Her throat was slashed so deeply that it nearly reached her spine. She had been dead in an instant. The thing he did thereafter, though, was the worst part. His attempts to make a statement were evident in the cuts he made on her body. Annie Chapman was located on September 8th, 1 week subsequent. A home on Hanbury Street had abandoned her in the backyard. While her body was opened up, she also had cuts to her throat. They removed sections of her internal organs and set them side by side with her. Someone seemed to have done it slowly, methodically. The murderer was widely thought to have possessed knife skills, potentially a medical professional, a butcher perhaps. The nation's economic prosperity is strongly linked to the serial killer phenomenon. On the same night, within minutes of each other, the third and fourth casualties arrived. Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered first on September 30th. It was not, however, cut open like the others. Some people felt someone had interrupted the killer. Mitre Square was the site of Catherine Eddowes's discovery at about 1:45 a.m. Once again, her face bore cut wounds, her kidney was gone, and an apron fragment was discovered close by, along by unexplained graffiti on the wall. The body of Mary Jane Kelly, the last known victim, was discovered on November 9th. This young woman was just 25 years old. The act of killing her was the most horrific. It took place inside, in the little room she had rented on Miller's Court. Upon seeing her dismembered body, the cops were taken aback. The room was a mess of organs. She was completely disfigured, even down to her face. It seemed as though the murderer had deliberated his actions, well aware that no one would intervene. Not only did these 5 murders rock Whitechapel, but the whole city of London. If you want to know which country was wealthiest while Jack the Ripper was around, it was England. Also, serial killers are popping up in India, which is a sign that the country is becoming even wealthier. More and more of them will appear here, you see. In the eyes of the FBI, they are known as serial murderers. The details were published in newspapers. The killer remained a topic of constant conversation. People thought Jack the Ripper was involved with some underground organization. He was considered to be wealthy and possibly influential by others. Having the sense that anyone may be the next victim only made things worse. People felt threatened because of the manner the bodies were left, the repetitive nature of the crimes, and the killer's evasion of capture.
This was the first time the city had to deal with the thought that one individual could cause this much fear. Historians disagree on how many women really fell victim to Jack the Ripper. The official tally was merely 5. As a result of the murders, the plight of London's underprivileged became public knowledge. Whitechapel and similar locations were mostly disregarded by society before to the murders. It had a reputation for being a hangout for criminals, inebriates, and lazy individuals. However, at this point in time, the public was being compelled to look at photographs of dilapidated buildings and shadowy lanes by the press. Breakfast conversations all throughout the city started talking about children who were famished and shelters that were too full. Jack the Ripper was the mastermind behind it all. His atrocities brought the plight of the destitute into the public eye. The murders committed by Jack the Ripper in the United States gained widespread attention because they occurred around the same time as the invention of the telephone, the telegraph, and the commencement of mass media, specifically the production of newspapers. Because of that, he became famous and began to court the press. I adored it. At the time, there were debates in Parliament regarding whether or not the government had succeeded. With no running water or heat, why were people squeezing into so small spaces? What was the rationale behind women's slumber in brothels and on the streets? Only to stay alive. Some attempted to refocus attention on finding the murderer, but the fact remained that the system had neglected its people for far too long, and that was the root cause of these killings. As time went on, Jack the Ripper's narrative became more than just headlines. All at once, it was thrilling, terrifying, and shocking. A lot of people's perceptions of the canonical 5 came from the media. As far as the authorities were concerned, these 5 ladies were all murdered by the same individual. But people in the media and the general public began to view these ladies less as persons and more as pieces of a complicated mosaic. Articles tore into their private lives, photographs of them were published, and their names entered the shadowy annals of London lore. There were detectives on staff at the London Metropolitan Police, but not much else. A DNA test was not conducted, because modern DNA testing began in 1986. For the most part, they had to just walk the streets, ask people questions, and cross their fingers that someone would notice. It was not easy to question folks at Whitechapel. The locals thought the cops were indifferent until a corpse was found. The English language was not universally understood. For others, the continual threat of arrest made it impossible to speak out, fearing for their safety or encountering the Jack the Ripper. That doesn't mean anyone would have spoken out if they had witnessed anything. And he knew they couldn't harm him because he was a very senior Freemason in the same lodge as the king to be with the 7th. Also, the number of individuals in control was excessive. The region of 1 square mile within the City of London was under the authority of the City of London Police, although the rest of London was patrolled by the Metropolitan Police. The murders took place close to the boundary between the 2 zones. This led to constant uncertainty regarding which police department was in charge, and ultimately had the last word whenever a fresh body was discovered. While they fought or attempted to provide evidence, precious time was wasted. After questioning potential suspects, following leads, and even bringing in bloodhounds, the police eventually gave up and called it quits. Hundreds more letters purportedly from the murderer also arrived. While the majority were hoaxes, a few stood out, notably one that bore the signature of Jack the Ripper. Our modern understanding of a pseudonym can be traced back to that name. The letter implicated the sender in the 8th of September murder of Annie Chapman and
threatened to cut off the next victim's ear before reporting it to the authorities. The murderer may or may not have written it, but either way it had an impact. Meticulously constructed such that every item of evidence suggesting he killed her was rebutted by another piece of evidence indicating he couldn't have pulled it off. In addition, the case is extraordinary. Plus, Herbert Wallace was someone I wanted to pursue. Now the killer's name sounded like a monster from a scary book. It empowered him even as he remained concealed. As time went on, the police had a harder and harder time. It got worse. People were getting increasingly agitated. People flocked to the sites of the crimes, with some pointing fingers at the Jewish population. Some pointed the finger at foreign nationals. Consequently, police had to subdue rioters, shield suspects from attackers, and deal with media that branded them as losers. The fact that the Ripper knew the city better than the cops was perhaps the greatest obstacle the authorities encountered. During 1986 and 1987, in preparation for the centennial, which naturally took place in 1988. At this point, I learned that the chief of the CID, who was overseeing the investigation, had stated that the serial killer was a destitute Polish Jew. As if on cue, he could disappear at any moment. It was almost if he was keeping tabs on them as well, constantly one move ahead. Their analysis was severely lacking, as we can see now that we were there. The idea was that they were reaching for an elusive shadow. All of this is becoming increasingly crucial as we draw nearer to discovering the identity of that shadow. Crimes that are committed with adequate preparation. Jack the Ripper was unique in that his murders were well planned. He preyed on women in London's East End who were prostitutes, homeless, and economically disadvantaged. Striking up conversations with these women was a breeze. No one would bat an eye if a man walked off into the night with a woman offering sex for a few cents in that section of Whitechapel. The 5 canonical victims were all assassinated somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning. On the dot. There wasn't a lot of traffic, and the streets were deserted. Less interference and fewer onlookers were the results, regardless of who ripped them off. The Freemasons included Aberline. Sir Charles Warren's membership in the Freemasons was well known. Everyone could see it. Take Aberline as an example. He wasn't the one who was actually hunting the Ripper. Warren was meant to be, which he didn't. He exemplified the epitome of sexism. To be more specific, he despised a certain woman whom he saw as the world's lowest prostitute. He mercilessly ended the lives of his victims, fully aware of the significance of timing. For example, the backyard where Annie Chapman was killed was surrounded by walls and gates, making it difficult to reach in a casual manner. Still, nobody saw the murderer take her there, carry out the murder, dismember her body, and then disappear. That betrays an acquaintance with the neighborhood, the kind of person who could tell which yards were unoccupied and which doors were open. Catherine Eddowes is another example, slain in the double event that occurred on the identical night as Elizabeth Stride. After that, he continued on, and Eddowes was found dead in Mitre Square in 45 minutes. Within an hour, this spot crossed police limits, and ended up in London proper, not Whitechapel. Once again, it demonstrated preparation, or at least assurance in the ability to cross borders undetected. The mutilations alone would have led one to believe that the murderer had any medical training. Several victims were evaluated by Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon. He had been positively recognized, after all. He knew the Ripper's identity better than anyone else we have. The murderer appeared to be familiar with the locations of specific organs, he observed. As it pertains to Mary Jane Kelly, a portion of her was lying about the room at 13 Miller's Court after the mutilations were so severe. She lacked a beating heart. However, the entire structure remained silent. There was no way the degree of brutality and subsequent quiet was an unplanned assault. This went beyond just the homicides. Very little tangible proof of the murder remains. No one's belongings were left behind by the Ripper. Then he disappeared. When he was in a world devoid of fingerprinting, lamps, and cameras, he vanished into thin air. Many questions arose as a result of this. He may have been a barber surgeon, someone versed in basic anatomy who was accustomed to cutting flesh, according to some. His seeming accuracy in removing organs only served to strengthen this notion. But no one ever faced charges related to the crimes that involved such abilities. Additionally, the letters contributed to his persona, or what the public and media perceived of him to be. After receiving the Dear Boss letter, the Central News Agency couldn't help but make fun of the police force's actions. Subsequently, the discovery of Catherine Eddowes with one earlobe slit raised suspicions that the letter might be real. Regardless of whether the murderer sent it or not, it demonstrated that he was well versed in manipulating the city. Freemasons aren't the focus of my book. A serial killer who was also a Freemason is the horrific protagonist of my tale. The Metropolitan Police Chief and every single one of his detectives were Freemasons. Among them, the killer's actions horrified the general public and sent the authorities into a state of panic. After Eddowes' murder, their inability to work together became glaringly clear. A message had been scrawled in chalk near the crime scene. No matter what happens, the men of the Jewies will never be held responsible. For fear of inciting anti-Semitic riots, Sir Charles Warren personally had the sign erased before it could be photographed. That choice is still divisive. The element of panic was another obstacle. Londoners were enthralled with Jack the Ripper once he was named by the press. A strange aura hung over every shadow. Having blades on hand or behaving suspiciously alone was enough to have men arrested. For fun, some members of the audience even donned murder masks and pretended to carry out the murder. Time and resources were squandered by these unproductive leads. Inspector Frederick Aberline and other investigators faced tremendous public and governmental pressure. Respected for his work in the field, Aberline was a lead detective at Scotland Yard. Later on, though, even he conceded that they were completely sunk. Because of the high volume of tips, hoaxes, and political involvement, many good leads went unnoticed. Additionally, a cohesive approach to the investigation was lacking. For 1 week, the cops needed a butcher. Doctors, immigrants, and then insane people were among those apprehended the very following day. They were looking in all the wrong places because they lacked forensic equipment and expertise in criminal profiling. The killer observed all of this while it was happening. Whether it was because he was a news junkie or just knew his way around the system, he remained elusive. Whoever he was, he fit in flawlessly, and that stillness might have been the biggest clue of all. In order to keep the most famous Freemason alive, Sir Charles Warren, out of the case involving Jack the Ripper, he was made up inside the myth as the investigator who was hunting him. For over 100 years, that's why specialists persisted in their excavating. To better comprehend how Jack the Ripper managed to evade capture, it is helpful to have some background knowledge on his methods and the inadequacies of the investigation. Montague John Druitt, a former school teacher and barrister, was one of the first and most often named suspects. Druitt attended Winchester College and Oxford University. He was born into an illustrious family. Additionally, he had a background of unstable mental health. His death's timing was the main attraction. It appears that Druitt committed suicide in December 1888. His body was recovered from the Thames River. According to a letter found in the archives of Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnagden, Druitt was diagnosed with sexual insanity, and his demise occurred at the same time as the canonical killings came to a stop. Even though he lacked concrete proof, Macnagden thought this was crucial. Druitt had a tenuous link to Whitechapel, and there is no documentation of his ever being apprehended or interrogated. Aaron Kuzminski came next, a highly mentally sick Polish Jew residing in Whitechapel. In 1891, he was locked up in a mental institution. Sir Macnagden wrote in a memo that Kosminski was thought to have a deep-seated animosity towards females and violent tendencies. Swanson went so far as to say that a witness had positively identified Kosminski, but that witness was unwilling to testify. This would go on to become a contentious point in ripperology years later. Because of his mental instability and closeness to the crime scenes, some suspect that Kosminski was the murderer. On the other hand, his detractors note that he stayed in asylums for decades, following the killings and never acted similarly. There was never any hard proof linking him to the crimes. Michael Ostrog was also a suspect. From Russia, this scam artist and robber has a lengthy history of illegal activity. He was a notorious pseudonym user who spent time in asylums and jails all throughout
Europe and Britain. Macnagden thought he was violent, but subsequent studies revealed that Ostrog was probably in prison while the Ripper murders were taking place. As more and more dates didn't add up, the theory that had been guiding him began to crumble. Needless to say, there were more. George Chapman, whose given name was Severin Klosowski, was a barber and surgeon originally from Poland who was hung in 1903 for poisoning 3 of his wives. Because of his anatomical expertise and residence in Whitechapel during the murders, Inspector Aberline considered Chapman a possible strong candidate. No evidence ever linked Chapman to a Ripper crime site, and his recorded crimes were poisonings rather than mutilations. According to more extreme accounts, the grandson of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert Victor, was involved in an affair with a Catholic shopgirl and the father of a child. This allegedly prompted a royal cover-up and the assassination of many witnesses. Some went so far as to say they were the Ripper themselves. Nevertheless, historians have extensively disproved this notion, which gained popularity through media. Prince Albert had established alibis for the killings, including the fact that he was not in London on multiple occasions. Sir William Gull, the royal physician, and the notion that he was involved in a Masonic plot are both dismissed. Stephen Knight and others romanticized this idea, which was more based on fiction than reality, in works like Jack the Ripper and The Final Solution, as well as in subsequent films. Nothing has ever been proven that would connect Gull to the case. Contemporary forensic analyses have re-examined long-dead suspects in recent years. Using mitochondrial DNA from a shawl purportedly owned by Catherine Eddowes, businessman Russell Edwards asserted in 2014 that he had unraveled the enigma. A descendant of Kosminski was found to be a match, he claimed. However, naysayers wasted no time pointing out problems with the testing procedure, potential contamination, and the lack of transparency in the shawl's chain of custody. The results are questionable until its provenance is confirmed. Truthfully, no one has ever been proven to be Jack the Ripper, despite the abundance of hypotheses. For decades, investigators, reporters, and amateur detectives have been unable to pin down the killer's identity. Whatever Jack the Ripper was, he didn't stick out from the crowd, according to the circumstances surrounding these individuals' lives, actions, and dispositions. Perhaps that was the most important factor in his escape. However, the recent discovery alters the course of events. The influence of DNA, the results of DNA testing provide much more than simply hard scientific evidence. The 5 classic victims' families were only nameless entries behind a horrific headline for more than 13 decades. Even after all these years, nobody ever found out who killed these women or why. The world continued to spin, in a sense. The unsolved mystery has always left a void in the lives of those associated with the names Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Accordingly, when forensics expert Dr. Jari Lou Helenen and Russell Edwards examined the mitochondrial DNA of the shawl that was supposedly discovered with Catherine Eddowes' remains, they were able to establish a connection between the shawl and the Kosminski family. In that split second, the file was reopened, this time with an eye toward truth rather than spectacle. Even though the shawl's provenance is still up for question, the findings provide hope that long-lost answers may be uncovered. Since then, forensic science has come a long way. Once a mystery, mitochondrial DNA is now essential for establishing identities, even in severely damaged samples. Methods like as familial DNA matching, which involves tracing a suspect through a relative, have helped solve cold cases in the U.S. decades after they occurred. Among the most well-known instances is that of the Golden State Killer. California was the site of more than 50 rapes and 13 murders committed by Joseph James DeAngelo between 1974 and 1986. After more than 40 years of eluding capture, detectives finally tracked him down to DeAngelo after using genealogical databases to identify a distant cousin. He entered a guilty plea in 2020. In Canada, DNA evidence linked the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessup to Calvin Hoover, a man who passed away in 2015. The case was eventually solved in 2020. Not even on the list of suspects was his name ever mentioned. Yet again, the use of genetic testing has allowed for the hitherto unimaginable. It is also clear from these situations how dangerous it is to be able to blend in
with your surroundings. For example, DeAngelo was a police officer. The process was clear to him. He was skilled at deceiving investigators, leaving no trace of his activities and knowing when to stop. These criminals are masters at disguising themselves. Luck isn't their only strategy. Using systems and blind spots, they prey on users. Crimes perpetrated by diligent criminals continue to elude authorities, despite the availability of modern technology. An example of this would be the serial murderer case on Long Island. Along Ocean Parkway in Suffolk County, New York, a serial murderer left behind at least 11 bodies, the majority of whom were likely sex workers. Forensic analysis and extensive media coverage failed to yield a solution to the case for more than 10 years. Modern forensic tools and mobile phone records finally led to Rex Hoyerman's arrest in 2023. It still required a lot of complicated labor over a number of years. Even with state-of-the-art forensics, digital trails, and surveillance, that is. To put it in perspective, think of the difficulty in the 1800s. Genomic analysis, nationwide databases, or surveillance cameras were non-existent. The topic of fingerprinting has only just begun to garner attention. There was no official system of criminal profiling. Furthermore, the investigators tasked with solving the Ripper murders were understaffed, underprepared, and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the carnage they saw. It is not unexpected that the killer evaded capture due to his nocturnal strikes, use of back alleys, and disappearance into the Whitechapel Street's labyrinthine layout. He probably stood close and observed the cops' search. A grin spread across his face when he read about himself in the news. The discovery of DNA has shown us that records and memories can only tell us so much. Evil, however, isn't necessarily covert, as this incident serves to remind us. On the street, it goes by us. Identical stores are frequented by it. Positions that establish credibility are ideal for it. Furthermore, it has the potential to vanish unless we employ appropriate search strategies. Do you have any opinions? Was justice served by the DNA revelation? Alternatively, are the story's unresolved questions still a problem? Leave a remark with your ideas. We'd really appreciate it. Please subscribe, like, and share for more content like this. Please also click on the video that is now displayed on your screen. It will be fun for you.